Hello and welcome to Agents of Nonprofit. My name is Alexander Lapa, and I'm here to speak with everyday superheroes helping nonprofits. Joining me today is Mike Prosserman to talk about succession. Mike, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
And I think I mispronounced your name at Prosserman or Prosserman. I noticed, I don't know if it's an American thing versus a Canadian thing. We tend to say pro or pra. One country says one and one says the other. Now I'm getting confused which one is which. If I mispronounce your name, I apologize, but it's just a cultural thing.
It's all good. All good. It's Prosserman. So you did well.
Awesome. Good. Okay, so today's topic, succession, which is a interesting, delicate, and important conversation. But before we get into that, I wanted to allow you a couple minutes to talk about, what is your superhero origin story? That is to say, how did you get started working with nonprofits?
Yeah, I definitely wouldn't consider myself a superhero, but I do love the idea behind it. Personally, my journey has been pretty, I didn't plan to be in the nonprofit sector. I'll start by saying that. I didn't even know what the nonprofit sector was. To be completely honest, I started a program in high school when I was in grade 11. I was a breakdancer, a b-boy. Breaking had a big impact on my life. I became part of a community. A lot of my friends who were in my crew became like best friends to me and a support structure for me. And then I realized breaking as a sort of metaphor to life became this really important thing because I was able to express some of the stress and anger I had as a young person. And also while dealing with some pretty challenging things at home with my mom, who was struggling in a pretty serious way with her mental health. So, mental health had a big impact on my childhood, and breaking, or breakdancing as the media calls it, became sort of like an outlet and a community for me. So I kind of said, you know what, I want to combine these two things that matter a lot to me, breaking and mental health. And we created this event in high school that grew into eventually a nonprofit. When I went to university, I decided to register as a nonprofit. And then 15 years later, with an amazing team of artists, staff, board, volunteer, we grew it to about 15 full-time staff across Canada, and just kept, doing more programs based on what the young people were asking for. And about 6 years ago now, I decided to leave. But that we'll talk about in a little bit.
It's, for some reason, it's more common than it should be that people don't want to be recognized as a superhero. But I disagree. I think, people like yourself who are doing this good work, helping people, having a voice, sharing knowledge. I mean, you're definitely a superhero in my eyes. So nice to see that you're humble, but I'm going to stick with that tag anyway.
Thank you. I'll take it today. And, I do think it's important that people are doing this work. And I think it's important to be motivated personally, from my perspective, for the right reasons. And those being just, contributing to something that you care about. And in the best of cases, I see it as something that's had an impact on your life. So I could be working a corporate job very well in marketing. That's what I graduated for in university. But I just knew I wanted to dedicate my life to other people, because I could just work a soulless job and I probably would have made a lot more money, honestly. But I decided, this was just a more meaningful way to live my life. And, we make choices, but I appreciate the kind gesture, and I'll take that today and wear it, because, sometimes I shy away from that stuff.
Awesome. Okay, let's jump into it then. Let's start by talking about succession, because it's a delicate topic in the sense that no one really wants to talk about it because it's an end state of some kind. But as I read in a LinkedIn article just recently, it's guaranteed to happen. So you might as well plan for it. You might as well plan ahead for it. My mom, for example, is really good at that. I know her, all the details of exactly what she wants to do at one moment in time. That's obviously sensitive for me. I'm even avoiding using certain words. But the idea is succession, in the case of a nonprofit, is when I guess we wanted to define it here before we continue, is when the ED, the executive director, has reached a certain point when it's time to step down. And there could be multiple reasons, I assume, why he or she would want to do that. But the concept is they're leaving their position to hand it off to someone else. And then there's a whole story that goes with it. So how would you maybe define succession a bit more succinctly than what I just did with the whole story behind it?
Yeah, I mean, there's succession and then there's transitions. And I think those
Mm.
are kind of two different things. Succession being the process of, finding a new leader to lead an organization. You could also, have succession for other key roles at the organization. But in this context, I'm talking about the main role of a charity or nonprofit, the executive director role. And then the transition I find is the more personal side to it. It's the piece where the emotions come into play. It's the before, it's the after. Not to say that succession planning, doesn't take that into account, but I think the transition is what I'm most interested in because without the human elements of, the career planning for the individual who's moving on, the care for the people who are involved, the team, how they're impacted by these transitions. To me, transition feels like the longer experience, and the succession is more about the hiring process specifically. So I could be wrong. Maybe you could Google a definition, but I'm pretty sure, when you hire a recruiter, focus on succession, they're focused on the hire, and they're concerned with them staying. Some of them will have like a retainer that says if the person doesn't stay for a whole year, then, we can, maybe start again for a lower cost or for free in some cases. But beyond the year, it's like that transition isn't really thought about as extensively in most cases, which is a big missed opportunity because there are human emotions involved and there are people being impacted by these transitions in a significant way, especially in small nonprofits, which are the majority of nonprofits and charities, in North America. So something to consider.
Thank you for the distinction between succession and transition. I was looping or grouping everything into one bucket called succession, but I think you're right. It's worthy to keep them separate because there are different angles and conversations to be had for each of these groups. So let's start then maybe with succession first and then move to transition. So you said finding a new leader, right? So what would be the trigger point for ED to say, maybe it is time for me to step down to do this transition to someone else? Is it something usually that they think of themselves? Is it something that's usually imposed upon them? Is it a combination, a third? I'm looking for more the most popular impacts or most common triggers that would cause an ED to say, maybe it's time to start planning for a succession.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, there are departure-defined successions where the ED themselves says, I want to leave at any given point. Maybe they found a new job. Maybe they, have a physical or mental health challenge that has pushed them to say, I can't do this anymore. Maybe they're just excited about wanting to jump into something else and they might not even know what that is yet. So that's like departure defined where they say, I'm going to change my job and I want to do this in a thoughtful and intentional way. That's where I like to spend the most time personally, because that's where we have the most control over setting up the organization for success. There's emergency succession planning, emergency transitions that have to happen. Maybe, God forbid someone has a heart attack and, they just, they can't do the job all of a sudden right away and someone needs to step in. Sometimes like a board member or an interim ED or, they would hire a staff member to just, hold the things down while they're trying to figure out what to do, and then decide if they're going to be hiring a new person or not. So I really, what I'm most intrigued by and where I personally made the choice to step down was a departure defined where I said, I'm going to do this in the next year or so. I think a year is personally a good timeline. I've seen people do more. I've seen people do less. But if you can have the time to take a year to do a departure defined transition, then I just see so many benefits from that for the organization, for the individual, for the new person coming in, for the board. There's just so much more room to plan, to think things through, to work through the difficult emotions of the team, of the community, of the individuals in transition, of board members who are busy and, don't have time for this stuff, but are now thrown into having to do this. So there's a lot that's involved with the transition, especially in a small nonprofit with less time, less money, less capacity in many cases. So, I really think, at least where I like to spend my energy thinking about it is, who's running organizations out there right now? When do you plan to leave? If you don't have an answer to that question, then, start thinking through some version of an answer in your head. Because if it's the day you die, then that's, that's going to be really difficult for you, for the org, for everyone, and probably not best for the organization. Like at some point, we cannot add value to the extent we could when we, maybe for the first 5 or even maybe 10 years. But I see people in roles for 25, 30 years, and I'm not saying that they're doing anything wrong, but there comes a point where you kind of get stuck in that job because you have no version of yourself where you can be in another job because you've been there so long. And then you start planning retirement in that job. And again, that's not a bad thing, but you're kind of stuck and the organization is stuck with you. And, if it wasn't a good relationship, that's when things can become very, very challenging. So I would say, just again, from my personal experience, there's no good or bad. There's no right timeline. But if you're not thinking about it at all, then, you might find yourself in trouble when a disaster strikes, God forbid, or, you just have to move on, So I just really encourage every single person in a leadership position, especially the CEO or executive director, to start planning and really think it through and set a timeline, like even if it's a moving target, because if you don't, then you're just going to get blindsided. Someone, your board is going to fire you unexpectedly, in 20 years, or you're going to have, unfortunately, we all get something in life. And I just think it's not setting the organization up for success by not talking about it and, thinking it through.
Okay. So let's start with 1 year. I think that's also a reasonable time frame. It does take time to get things in motion, to get set up. And the way, when you were talking, the way that I would see this is kind of like a decision tree where you might have different entry points to that decision tree based on whether you just want to do something more interesting, or there's someone that enters your life that you think would be a great successor, or, whatever entrance criteria you can think of. And then from that, you would have a decision tree to say, well, based on this, here's where I think things should go. But I guess if we were to follow that kind of logic, in your opinion, how detailed should a succession plan get, in the sense of, should I maybe just start the conversation by thinking about what are the major milestones to consider? Is this a conversation I should be having with somebody else, or is it something as an ED or a primary position in a nonprofit do on their own? Should it be a collaborative effort? To what extent? Like, there's a whole bunch of questions I have, I guess. I don't want to try throwing you all of them at the same time, but I'm just trying to add a bit of structure here. What would be, to maybe form a question, let's go with the decision-making process itself. Is that something that you would normally recommend doing as a solo person and then sharing it, or at least getting to a certain, maybe 75% complete version of it, then sharing with others, and then refining that last 25% as a group, or some other mechanism?
Yeah, I mean, there's no science to it, but what I would say is every succession plan, and that can be simply, if this were to happen in a departure defined way, like where I say I'm going to do it, let's say, and give a 1 year timeline or a 6 month timeline or whatever this timeline is, create a work back schedule. What would you need to do? Hire a recruiter by this point, or decide if the board's going to do the recruitment, get this person, do first round, second round, third round interviews, hire the person by X date, have this many dates, 90 days of onboarding, et cetera, et cetera. And then, here's my last day. So like, have a timeline, have a job description, like an updated job description. There's probably nothing more important in a classic succession plan than having your actual job description. Because executive directors, I see them laugh often at their job description. We work with so many executive directors of small charities because you read the job description and it's not what you do. You do a million more things. Now, the question is, what should you be doing as an executive director? Realistically, what is your role? And I think it's so important to revisit this question and rewrite this job description so it's thorough, so that if you were give it to someone who were to do your job, it would be true. It wouldn't just be like, a checkbox that would then be setting them up for failure because they have no idea what they're signing themselves up for. Organize your systems. I think getting your filing and your finances and anything that is only in your head, write it down and put it in a folder. If it's a bank access code or, a relationship with a donor that's very unique, document those relationships. In fact, bring other people in on them. I think transferring relationships is a great succession plan. Having people attend meetings so you're not the only one who holds every relationship. I hear a lot of people say, oh, I can't leave because the organization needs me. Well, in many cases, you've created that problem. No offense, but you can uncreate that problem, and it's a process. Bring other people in, empower other people to run meetings and take the center stage. Don't always be the one talking. Don't be the only one being interviewed by media. If your organization, your cause is being interviewed, let other people's visions come to life so that, again, the organization is less dependent on you. I mean, this is a little bit of the transition stuff, but in terms of succession specifically, like the planning portion, write a 90-day onboarding plan. What is everything you would need to tell this new person who takes your job so that they can successfully do the job and not find a bunch of surprises that are going to get them in, some deep stuff later on. So it's really, really important that you do this. And you asked sort of the question, like, how much should you do on your own versus how much should you do with your with others? I would say, if you can accomplish at least those things and also have your board evaluate your performance, because if you don't even know how you're doing in your job, how are you going to benchmark that against a new person coming in? Everyone always, I've heard so many people say, it's going to be impossible to replace you. It's not the idea to replace you. The idea is to find a new person who can do the job. Replacing any person is an impossible task. It's not realistic, especially a lot of people who've been in orgs for a long time. So you have to sort of remove yourself from the organization and decenter yourself so that others can hold it up. And in terms of planning, I would say board members need to be involved, especially the board chair. Like, you have to have a strong and tight relationship between ED and board chair. If it's not strong and you make this transition, there's a lot of opportunity for disaster. And I've seen it happen too many times where orgs die in this process because the relationship with the board chair and the ED is not trusting, it's not caring, and it's not one where the ED and the board chair have enough time together. They need to spend, I'm convinced you should be meeting at least once a month, ideally once every 2 weeks, especially once a transition starts. I would say once a week, just to check in, ideally in person. Like, this is how serious and important it is. And if you're not doing that, if you're speaking to your board chair once every 3 months or every board meeting, like, it's their job technically to replace the executive director. So if they're doing that in isolation, the executive director might have valuable knowledge it's missing from that conversation. And if they're not aware that they're supposed to be doing that, then the executive director may feel like they can never do it because, the people who are supposed to make that transition happen are unaware of how to do it or that they even have to do it. So I think there's a really critical relationship piece. So I'd say start to answer your question in the longest way possible. I'd say start working with your board chair in a trusted way where you're saying, hey, like, we're going to talk about this. I'm not doing this. I have no timeline, and be honest about it. Don't start having meetings behind my back, because if you do, that's going to break my trust. Yeah, and this is another thing I see happen all the time, and it drives me nuts. When the ED starts talking about it for the first time and the board chair runs off to the board, has a secret meeting and says, I think they're going to leave. Don't do that. Like, if you do that, you're breaking trust. Trust is the only thing we have in the transition process. And if you break it, apologize. And if you can't apologize, I almost guarantee you someone's going to be withholding information that can make the transition more successful because they don't care anymore. They check out, right? Like, if you're disrespected on a human level, especially if you've dedicated your whole life to this organization, how are you going to, show up and say, oh yeah, I'm going to give you all the files to, that you're asking for, when you just, didn't realize it, but indirectly, treated me like dirt. And now I feel like, well, I don't really owe you anything, actually. So I've seen people, I'm not saying this is my experience, but I've seen so many people who are running charities get into this icky situation where they just like check out because they're not being treated with respect between their board and them in a transition. So I'd say really, truly, it's a partnership. It's like a marriage. And, if we don't hold these emotions, in a respectful way, then we might as well just, throw out the whole transition. Like, you're really gambling, and you could really destroy an organization. And I've seen it happen too many times. So that's why I'm so passionate about this, because like, there's so many preventable things that continue to go wrong in the sector. And I'm like, why does this keep happening? Why do board chairs not give the empathy for the leader leaving And I would challenge this to be a very human process. Like, be kind to each other, you know? Like, it's not straight business. Like, this is not a business transaction, and it's even less so in the charitable sector, especially in small charities and nonprofits. So, like, if you treat it like a big company, succession in a big company, you're going to really burn some bridges, and you might be the person who kills the organization by not making this a human process. So, obviously, I'm passionate about this. Sorry for my little rant there, my soapbox rant, but this is something I really see go wrong so often, and it's so easily preventable if we just treated each other with respect.
Wow, there's a lot to unpack there. Thank you. There's just a lot. Lots of details, lots of actionable elements, lots of passion as well and emotion. But the one thing that caught my attention, especially at the beginning, and I got kind of stuck on it, you used the word work back in terms of timeline. And I want to make sure that was what what I expected it to be, in the sense that if you are planning a succession to be happening in a year from now, you work back from that time. So 2 weeks before that 1 year mark, this should be done. 2 weeks from that date, backwards in time, this should be done. And you work your way backwards to the present day. Is that what you were intending to say, or is it more forward time planning?
Yeah, I mean, like, ideally, it's a 4 to 6 month runway, and you're saying, you know, as soon as I say I'm doing this, or as soon as it's announced that I'm doing this, again, this is an announced succession,
Mm-hmm.
not like an emergency one,
Right.
then these are the steps that go into place. And I think you also got to get your board engaged on that, because they have to do the work. This is where I think a lot of boards don't understand. They're like, oh, I actually have to dedicate a lot more time, even as a general board member, to this process. Because, like, if, some boards I see say, oh, we're going to post it ourselves. And, like, that's a huge job. Like, you have to give at least, 4 to 6 hours a week on something like that for up to 6 months if you're a board member, like, if you want to do this properly and, do the interview process yourself. So I would just caution board members when they set this timeline that it's realistic, that they can commit that time once things go into motion, and prepare the rest of the board and say, like, look, if someone's not down to be a part of this, it's okay for you to step off the board. The worst thing you can have is two board members who just don't show up to any of it, and they're not on for the ride, because this is one of the most important things a board can do. And that timeline, the clock moves faster than you expect. And, like, the other thing people don't expect or plan for is, yeah, you say you're going to hire someone in 4 months, but realistically, you don't control who shows up to the interviews. And maybe your top two candidates get a job in the timeline before you've made the offer. So then what do you do? Do you repost? I've seen so many orgs in this position, like, too many times. So, like, the timeline has to have some flexibility, and people have to be aware that it's not, like, super strict. And if it doesn't hit these markers, you got to course correct, and you got to be flexible, because if you get too stuck on a timeline, then I find some people will follow it too closely, and that's when often the human element gets lost. And someone will say, well, you were supposed to leave by this day, but we need your help. Can you stay for another 6 months? And then maybe the ED says, okay, I can stay for 6 months. But then another 6 months passed and they still haven't replaced them. So then what is that person to do? And I've seen that happen to someone where they kept extending it because they just, quote unquote, couldn't find someone good enough. And it's just like, well, no, the board's not doing their job, and that's not fair to that leader. So there's a flexibility to that timeline. But yes, I'd say putting it down on paper is an important part of that process, and figuring out who's on your succession committee. You might not do that until the wheels sort of get into motion, but having a clear role description, like what's going to be involved in, anyone who's on this succession committee, because it's going to be a lot of work, and we need people with experience. We need people who understand the organization and what it needs deeply, not just, volunteer board members. You might get like a former staff member or someone from the community on that committee. I would really encourage that, because otherwise you're just like, board members sometimes don't know what they don't know, and that can be a dangerous place. Anyways, I'm getting into details, but that timeline needs to be there, and it needs to be flexible, is if I were to summarize it into like one sentence.
Again, lots of great information. I thank you. The second point I also want to draw attention to, and this is something I think deserves another underline, is the idea of replacement. I think I've seen this also in the corporate world many times over, where a manager leaves and then the replacement comes in, and it's not a replacement. It's someone new with their own views, perceptions, ideas, energy, I don't think it's reasonable or possible or even desired to try to replace someone with another person. In a way, you do want that new blood, the new energy, different perspective on things, to add a different element to the nonprofit in this case, so that it can become better, faster, stronger. So the idea of having it as a successor rather than a replacement, I think, is an important distinction. And I'm glad you mentioned that as well in your answer.
Yeah, I might add to that, and I'm really happy that you highlighted that, is people don't own charities, right? Like, I think people get confused by this. Like, it's such an important point. It's probably like you got to kind of say it out loud, because when you sell a business, you make a lot of money. When you leave a company, maybe you get a bonus in the business world. In a charity, you walk out with the exact salary you got paid. And if you negotiate like a 6-month bonus or like a year bonus, which is probably the most I've seen, like, you're really lucky. And that to me is really important, because if you're not taking that into consideration, it goes back to the beginning of this conversation. Like, you have to sacrifice a lot to do this work. And it sucks that you do that in many cases. And I'm talking, again, more specifically about smaller charities, who sometimes people don't pay themselves for the first year or two, especially when they found something. And then at the end of it, they have a new board chair who barely knows the organization 2 years in, who says, okay, this is how we have to do the succession. Like, it's got to be very professional. It's like, wait. Like, if you average my salary over the 20 years I've been here, it's actually, because I worked 5 years pretty much for free, I'm pretty much, minimum wage here if you average it. So, like, let's not be professional. Let's be human. And even though I don't own this and I have no power, because you as a volunteer board member who's been here for 2 years can, tell me, what my fate is, like, that's not a great position to be in. So I think it's really important we acknowledge the difference, that charities are not owned by anyone. And to your point, it's great. We have to set people up for this being a new and exciting thing, bringing in a new person, a different person, a person with a different energy. Because if you're trying to replace that person, it's not going to happen. You're going to fail. And then you're going to try to bring that person back in. When I left Unity after 15 years, I said, I don't want to be on the board. I don't want to be paid in any capacity. I just want to leave. And the board hired a recruiter. The recruiter hired an amazing ED, Rebecca Harrison, who's still there after 6 years. It was 6 years on March 1st. And she's doing an amazing job. And the team is doing an amazing job. I think we also put way too much weight in one leader, although she is incredible. And I give her a ton of credit. The team is also incredible, and the board is incredible, and then they've created a diverse pool of funders who, if one leaves, there'll be more to support that organization. So I think if we depend too much on the one job and say it all is gambled on that one person, then we are going to lose. It's like, but imagine you're betting on the whole team and you've prepared them, and the funders are even aware of this transition, and the community is welcoming this new person in. So if we sort of spread out some of that weight, it also can become much more manageable. But again, we sometimes see it as this, like, okay, we got to replace this person, and this person is like, going to do everything, or they're going to save us. And if you do that, you're most certainly setting yourself up for a disaster.
Up until now, we've been talking a lot about succession. I wanted to transition a bit to transition, in the sense of stuff that's things to keep in mind and keeping it human. You mentioned, keeping it personal, keeping it emotional. What are some things that either an ED or a board can do to help with that transition, the more emotional side, the more human side of things?
Yeah, and it's funny you mentioned that, because pretty much all I talk about is the human and emotional side. I pretty much probably talked only about that up until now. Like, I like how you pushed me to talk about some of the more technical things, which are very important. However, I do believe that most people get the human element wrong. I've yet to see anyone get it right. In Unity, I'm grateful that we got it right. Our board chair was incredibly empathetic. I personally had, a mental health breakdown towards my end of Unity. I developed anxiety. I just couldn't even get out of bed for 2 weeks. And that was around the time I decided I was going to take a sabbatical, which when I went on vacation, decided that was going to be my transition. I was just going to leave. All that to be said, my board chair showed up to my house with food, like he cared about me as a human being. And because of that, I had a deep sense of respect and trust that he would steward the organization. No matter what he chose to do, I just trusted that he cared about me as a person and he cared about the organization. And I think it's the only time I've ever seen that. I've seen it almost every other time where the board chair or the committee says, okay, we got to be professional. So being professional means not being nice. And I think that is the biggest misconception. And, I think, unfortunately, because a lot of business community members who are board members are used to seeing transitions or succession being this sort of rip off the Band-Aid approach, again, a founder who's worked, if you average their salary minimum wage because they work 5 years for free or barely at all while working another job, is being told that they can't get 3 months a bonus as they figure out what they're going to do with their life or pay for their therapy as they, figure out, how to get their identity removed from this organization and develop themselves as a person outside of this job. Like if a board chair is like, no, we can't do that. Are you kidding me? Like, I'm not saying you can or can't afford something, but like, imagine being in that person's shoes. And then they're like, okay, screw this. Like I'm checked the hell out. And I have 10 things that I'm not going to tell you that are probably going to cause you now a lot of pain because you didn't do that. And, to be honest, I've seen a lot of leaders feel that way, but still give up that information because they care so much about the org, even though that person treated them with disrespect, and they still do the right thing, which is obviously do what's good for the community, do what's good for the org. But I'll tell you, like, it doesn't need to be that way because it's as simple as treating people with respect, caring for them as human beings, caring for the team as human beings, not just the ED, because the team might be struggling and suffering and worried and not sure if they're going to have jobs and all these things. So reassuring the team, that same board chair showed up every month in person to the team, and the in-person matters, to just tell them what was going on, and they could ask any questions they wanted. Like, this is the type of thing I'm talking about that a lot of board chairs just don't do. Like, big props to Adam Silver, not the basketball one, but the one who did our transition. And we're still good friends, to this very day because of, what he did and how he did it. And I just think kindness is it goes further than you could imagine. And, the other thing I've seen happen too often is people make mistakes or they pretend like they know what they're doing. Like boards are pretending because they actually don't know. They're scared too. And I understand you're a volunteer. You don't know what you're doing when you're doing this succession. It's a new thing. That being said, the transition process, like if you make a mistake, if you hurt someone's feelings, apologize, face it, say, you know what I did there was wrong. I feel badly about it. Let's work through this together, versus just pretending and being professional and saying, you know what, I'm going to crack some eggs as I do this and just accepting like that. That is not going to be a successful strategy in a small nonprofit succession. It's just not. And I've seen many organizations close down. I can count more than on my hands now, unfortunately, in the last few years because of mismanaged transitions, often because of a lack of human empathy for the people coming into the roles. And I'll just add one more thing, which I didn't mention at all yet, which is the person coming into the job, the new executive director, needs just as much of that support. And just once you're like, okay, cool, you have the job, your job is not done. Like the job does not end by hiring the new person. It's just begun. Like you're 50% of the way through, because if that person is unable to perform their job, they have to be supported. And the difference between supported and monitored is a fine line, because sometimes boards will just focus on evaluating that person, but it's actually more about caring for that person, supporting that person. Again, it goes back to the human element. Like, how do I give you what you need to be successful? We selected you because we believe you're the right person for this job, but we know this is an impossible job. Like, anyone who's been in an EED knows it's an impossible job, and you only know what it's like until you've been in that job, where everyone's job is on your shoulders, even though it's, distributed, but like the buck stops with you, right? So if this is someone's first ED-ship, like their first time in the role, or even if it's not, and it's a new type of an organization, that person as a human being, they need that support, and a new job begins when their job starts. So I think we often focus up until the hire is made, and that's a huge missed opportunity because that new person, it's a whole other transition process for them. So we have to respect that. Anyways, that's my rant. I'm a soapbox ranter. I apologize to not giving you a chance to breathe there.
No apology needed, really. This is great. The idea for the new ED in this case is you definitely want to set them up for success. Give them all the tools, all the support, all the hand-holding as necessary so that they can stand on their own 2 feet. And it doesn't take a day or a week, right? Or even a month, I'm sure. It usually takes much longer than that. So I like the idea of perceiving it as only 50%. Like, I'm very mathematical, right? So when hiring the new ED and the day they step through the door, that's 50% of your job, right? I think it's a great analogy because you can see there's a lot more to go to it. You're only halfway there. So I like that. I also would say, so it sounds like it sounds basic if I were to use that word, but it's very human, right? All the things that a board can do to help the outgoing ED is really just being human, right? You mentioned respect, trust, empathy. Oh, that was the comment I was thinking of, and I couldn't think of. Professional. Professional is not being nice. That's a very interesting definition. I kind of like it because it's a bit cold and awful, but it's a really accurate in some ways too. So we definitely don't want to be professional, or at least according to that, we want to be nice, right? We want to be kind. We want to be empathetic. These are all traits that we need to amplify, I think, as board members to ease the transition of the person leaving and ease the transition of the person coming in. So is there any way that you can help foster these kinds of emotions, or at least help initiate some kind of empathy process? Like, I find sometimes going through sitting down and really visualizing what that person is going through is an exercise that can really, really help. Are there things like that you sometimes recommend to boards or to other people who are supporting the outgoing ED that can help with that transition? Or is there any other tools, I guess, that you can offer or add or comment on that can help with that transition?
Yeah, several. I mean, I'd start by saying, listen to this podcast. I think hearing people's stories, real stories, is helpful. Leaning on a human who's gone through it is a powerful thing. That's also why I wrote my book. That's also, why I speak about succession on podcasts often, because I really think we need to share these stories. And they're often not shared because they're so taboo. And people obviously want to protect their future careers. So they're not going to, talk trash about their, past boss. But the fact is, somehow these stories, these narratives have to be shared. So maybe it's one-on-one, right? So I'd really encourage, if someone went through a transition and you get the sense that it might have not been great, take them for coffee, because, they may not be able to share it on a podcast or in a book, but I would say take them for a coffee and just hear their experience. I did this thing about 3 years ago, where I interviewed 10 people who I know their transitions did not go well, incoming and outgoing EDs, and I anonymized the whole report just for that very purpose. So, happy to share that link with you in the podcast if folks are interested to check it out, because I think we need to hear the stories that we never hear. And we never hear those stories because, they're tough stories and they're hard to tell. So the other thing I'd say is there is this really great resource, and I think it was from an organization called the Building Movement that has now sort of shifted their energies to different types of work. But at one point, they really focused on, long-time executive director transitions. And there's this one graph that I always draw out for people. It's what's that thing called? A Venn diagram. And the one side circle is, what do I need as an individual? So this is talking about the person who's leaving. What do you need? I need respect. I need compensation. I need, maybe I need to grieve. I need to go through a grieving process that I may not be completely ready for. I need, whatever you need, list it out in detail and actually get detailed about it. Then the other circle that sort of overlaps that circle is, what does my organization need? So, the interesting thing is your organization needs stable finances, diversified revenue, strong board chair, navigating the transition. Ideally, that board chair stays at least a year after so they can see the results of that and support the results of that. Like, get specific. What does your organization need? At least, 6-month financial runway, ideally, in the best of cases. All these things. And then in the middle, where the two circles overlap, where do your needs with your organization overlap and where do they not? And I think that's the conversation we often don't have, is we don't talk about our needs as leaders when we're going through these transitions, when they don't overlap with our organization's needs, because you have personal needs that are different from your organization's needs. And it's really important to talk about that, at least with one trusted person, which is why I always go back to the board chair, because that relationship in a transition is so important. And you should be able to have difficult conversations where you can trust the board chair is not going to turn around and go to the board and say, hey, the ED told me something. I feel the need to tell you, without asking that person permission, which is also another great example of where our board chair was amazing, because when I had my mental health challenges in that moment, I told him and I said, look, I have anxiety. My doctor told me this is what I'm going through. This is what I need. And he asked me permission. He's like, can I tell the board this? And I thought about it for a week. I said, I don't think so at the first in my head. But then I said, you know what? This is an organization that represents and supports young people's mental health through hip hop. And that's what we did. So I feel like if I can't talk about this to my board, if they have the wrong reaction, which is like try to let me go or do something weird, I don't want to be here anyway. So I said, like, tell them. And he told them, and they supported me so fully and so in such a human way that I knew that but we had created an organization that really represented at all levels the values of what we were trying to do here. So that's my long way of saying there's a lot you can do. There's some good resources. And also, honestly, we're starting a coaching roster now of people who have gone through the process to just talk you through the emotions so that you can make better decisions along the way. Because a lot of people make the decisions when it's time to make them. And I think we can make the best decisions when we're thinking about this months and ideally years in advance, so that we can like really put some things in place with time to make it a more successful transition. And it's really hard to do that on your own. So that's a little program that we're building with our work at Epic.
Yeah, we'll be sure to add any links you provide into the show notes. So I appreciate those. I'm curious to know, and this might be a bit of an odd question, but I'll say it anyway. A transition could be seen as a time of celebration. It is a change, right? It's not necessarily an end. I mean, it is an end, but it could be perceived or reframed as a change, as a moving on to something maybe they're more passionate about, or I'm always trying to think of more positive than the negative side of things, but the idea of celebrating the transition period, is that something that normally is found? Is it not? Is it more like a, close the door on your way out type of concept? Or is it, do you see sometimes parties being thrown or special events being thrown to really thank the ED for all their work, especially that if they were doing, close to minimum wage for such a long period of time, something to really celebrate the occasion, because, why not party kind of thing, versus, thank you, there's the exit, see ya kind of thing.
100%. I think this is the most missed opportunity that most people don't do, because they don't want it to be about them, or they don't want it to be awkward, or I think we need to throw that out the window. I'll tell you, we did a celebration when I left. And again, I felt completely awkward, like, oh, it's about me. But like, it was a beautiful moment. And why it's beautiful, it's when you don't make it about the individual, but you make it about the impact, and you make it about, the generations of people that they've been able to connect with, and that have, then come back to support the organization in their own ways. There's so many like layers on how these things can be special if they're done in an authentic and genuine way. They can be really cheesy, and they can be, really awful, but like my view is we should do them and see what happens, because we don't do them enough. And I think people often just get a handshake, or especially now with the pandemic, like a virtual high five, and it's like the worst thing. And I can say this having spoken to a few leaders who've left during the pandemic, and it doesn't feel good. And I actually think the organization benefits from celebrating this person because it's closing a door. It's closure to some extent for the organization, saying thank you and actually remembering the good stuff. Because the other thing that's weird about, especially long time leader transitions is they're the easy villain. Like, if you think of an obvious villain in a movie or something, like for some reason, the executive director who's been there for a very long time is just the perfect villain. And we often villainize them wrongfully. And I think if we flip that and we celebrate them and we remember all the amazing things they did and said and, brought into the world in that organization, we give them a chance to, walk out with their pride. We give them a chance to, bring back some of those memories that are historically important to where the organization might, build from. And people feel genuinely appreciated. Like I actually took it as an opportunity to appreciate all the people in my team and in our community. And through that, it became this beautiful, like, I felt like I attended my funeral, like it was just like this incredible, unbelievable experience. And there were lots of tears shed, and it was just like a beautiful thing. So I would encourage it. I don't think it's done enough, especially post-pandemic. Do not have that party on Zoom. At least go for lunch or have a break bread together with, a couple of key and special people, because nowadays I see it happening more and more where it's just a Zoom goodbye. And that is just like, that's a tragedy. Like, I think it's such a missed opportunity. I mean, if the person did do something terrible, then like, that's a whole other conversation. But like, if they gave 30 years of their life and, done some incredible things that have allowed this organization to be possible, I think we should, give people their flowers and celebrate that. And I was lucky to have that opportunity, and I would recommend it to absolutely everyone, because then also the story that it ends with the organization is not written for them. It's written with them, So yeah, thanks for mentioning that. I'm happy you brought that up.
I think that's a good place to leave it as well, with a tearful celebration. So this has been great. Thank you so much, Mike. Where can people get in touch with you, maybe learn about this upcoming course and get access to these resources?
Yeah, if people check us out at epicleadership.ca, we're based in Canada. My book's up there, our coaching stuff. We also do peer groups for EDs, but even to just talk about it, like I'm happy to just chat with people. Anyone who's ever reached out to me, I've never said no to a meeting. But I really do think that we have to just have more conversations and share these stories. So please reach out. Like I really do welcome it. And Alex, I just wanted to thank you for taking the time to have me on the show today.
Well, thank you so much. This has been great. Keep doing this great work. It's much appreciated. It's needed. Yeah, it's one thing in life it's going to happen, right? So you might as well plan for it properly.
I couldn't agree more. We can do this better, but it doesn't just happen automatically.
Yeah. All right. Well, that's it for today. I'm Alexander Lapa, and I hope you join me again in the next Agents of Nonprofit.